The Rover P6 was Britain's answer to the Citroen DS, created with engineering know-how and design prowess that could take on the world and win. That handsome styling and futuristic interior won hearts the world over, and they sold close to 400,000 of these cars. What's more, after decades of being underappreciated, values are finally on the rise, but that does mean you need to look more carefully than ever. So here's everything that you need to know if you want to buy yourself a Rover P6. But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition. Like its Citroen DS rival, the P6 is a base unit, and that means all the strength and structure of the car is a skeleton and all the panels are actually just cosmetic. But that does mean that the strength of that structure is even more vital than it would be on a normal car. Looking for corrosion, you don't need to worry about the bonnet or the boot lid because they're aluminium, so they won't rust away. You might get the occasional bit of corrosion around paint chips and so on, but really it's nothing to worry about. However, with that base unit, you need to look at the strength of it, starting with the sills. The sills on a P6 are pretty much the most vital bit to be solid, so you want to check inside the front and rear wheel arches all the way along. Make sure that it's metal that is solid, not bodged up all the way along, because if it is rotten or it has been messed around with in the past, it's going to take vital strength away from the car, and that is a big problem. The P6's bell crank front suspension design means that the struts are mounted up horizontally to the engine in the bay. That was to give maximum space in here for the planned gas turbine power plant, but this is vital for the strength of the car and of course for the suspension being mounted. So you want to have a good look all the way along this seam, and crucially at the bulkhead, make sure there's no damp, no rot, no evidence of any corrosion there, because if there is, again, the car is pretty much a write-off. Just make sure that all this along here is clean. Moving along, you want to open the front doors and have a look at the B pillars. Again, it's another vital piece of structure in that base unit shell. See if there's any rot or any corrosion starting here, any damage if it's been crashed into in the past. Again, that should be arrow straight and rock solid. And a good way that you can check that the pillars are in good condition is the doors. Now, P6 doors are known to be perfectly shutting if the car is straight. So you just want to hold it near and let it drop. It should pretty much shut itself. It makes a beautiful noise, and when it is actually shut, check the shut lines all the way down, horizontally and vertically, make sure it's straight. Further down, you want to open the back doors and have a look kind of the inner rear arches, make sure that that is all solid. If the rear doors haven't been sealing properly, that can be starting rot in the rear arches. That is vital structure of that base unit, which could then ultimately be falling apart if it's not got on top of. You also want to have a look in the rear seat, would you believe it, for structure of the car. All you need to do is lift up the rear seat swab. It takes 2 seconds. And then you want to look under the sound deadening and carpet that's there. You can just lift it up, make sure that the rear arches and the rear bulkhead are all totally solid. It's all vital structure in the base unit of a P6, and it is nasty stuff to repair. So take the rear seat out and have a good old look there. The rear suspension design in a P6 means that boot space is pretty limited on the earlier cars, but in later P6s you could get what was known as the Continental kit, which would mount the spare wheel on the boot lid as opposed to vertically in the boot itself, giving you a nice extra bit of space back there. Open the boot, have a good look at how well it's mounted, look at the brackets underneath, make sure it's all solid, and if the wheel isn't sitting true and level, there's a good chance that either the boot lid has been buckled somehow or the kit isn't mounted properly. When you're walking around the car, you want to just check for general old car corrosion spots. So have a good look in the arches, feel all the way around, make sure they're smooth, look for any paint damage or bubbling on the front or rear wings. Again, you can buy new, but the prices of panels can very quickly mount up, and pay particular attention to the vinyl C pillar. If this is bubbling up with rust underneath it, it's serious rust repair work on a P6, because that's where a lot of your strength comes from. The P6 was offered with a 2 litre, 2.2 and of course the glorious all aluminium Buick V8, but whichever one you choose, they're all brilliant, but they do all need paying attention to. The 4-cylinder cars can leak water from their engine side plates, and of course if there's not enough water in the cooling system, they can overheat, so have a good look for any evidence of those cars starting to wet themselves. On the single carb engines, it's not uncommon for the exhaust manifolds to crack. They're made of a particularly thin metal. The twin carb engines, however, are a lot more solid. Any ringing from a 4-cylinder engine indicates a worn lower timing chain, whereas a clatter from the top half of the engine indicates a worn upper timing chain. And to be brutally honest, if you haven't got any history of the car, particularly if the mileage is getting up a bit, we'd advise changing it. For the price it costs and the time it takes, it's cheap insurance. Finally, on the 4-cylinder cars, they have got cork cam cover gaskets, which do the job when they're brand new. Over time they do perish, they do leak quite catastrophically. However, these days you can buy a modern rubber gasket for the cam covers and should be a lot more oil tight. However, this is a 60s British car, don't forget, so getting it completely oil tight is a bit of a fantasy. Broadly speaking though, the foreparts are smooth, reliable and durable as long as you keep an eye on them. And the same goes for this glorious aluminium Buick V8, but you do need to keep on top of the maintenance. Oil changes need to be done every 3,000 miles, and because it's all alloy, it is very picky about its coolant, so you need to be doing a coolant change at least once a year. Good quality coolant, flush it all the way through. If a previous owner hasn't been changing the oil often enough on the V8, that's going to cause rocker wear at the top end of the engine. If there's a bit of rattle coming from the top end, that would indicate slack engine servicing intervals. It's not terminal, you can get everything for a Rover V8, but consider very carefully how well looked after the car you're looking has been. Finally, regardless of what engine your P6 has got, you want to have a good look along the bulkhead. Look for the grommets that are on the throttle cable and the heater plenum drain tubes, because the rubber on those will perish over time. You'll get excessive heat and noise in the cabin, but more importantly, if there's rain, it will drain off the bonnet down there and you'll then get water ingress in the cabin. So check all rubber components, and with the introduction of E10 fuel in the UK, it's worth checking that the person you're buying from hasn't been running it on E10. These need super unleaded, ideally the best quality you can buy, because they're supposed to run on 5-star 100 octane with the Rover V8, and if you put normal, modern, cheap E10 in there, not only will it be really grumpy and horrible to drive, but it could be rotting out your fuel hoses as well. Gearbox wise, you get the P6 with either a Borg Warner 3-speed auto or a 4-speed manual. If the manual is feeling slightly sloppy, it's probably going to be worn bushes or linkages, but all those parts are available. The P6 has got fantastic aftermarket support. If the automatic gearbox is starting to flare a little bit, or it's kind of jumping between gears rather than slurring into them, it's probably a good sign that the oil is overdue for a change. It's not hard to do, it's not expensive. If you're a DIY mechanic, do it in an hour or so, and again, it will probably preserve the future of your gearbox. P6s have got all-round servo-assisted disc brakes, which means they stop incredibly well for a modern car, let alone for a car that came out in 1963. However, they've also got inboard rear brakes, which is very advanced for the time, but does mean that they are harder to maintain. Now, if you're game for actually getting under there and servicing those rear brakes, it's not too expensive. You can get an exchange reconditioned rear caliper for about 60 quid. But do bear in mind, if you've never done it before, it's not as easy as just whipping it off the hub like you do with most conventional cars. If you've never done inboard brakes before, get someone to help you do it. On pre-66 cars, they've got Dunlop brakes, and they are much harder to get parts for. There's not much support for them. Think about converting it to later style brakes. Early P6s were known to suffer with differential oil leaks, and what with those aforementioned inboard rear brakes isn't good. It'll contaminate them and ultimately you will lose rear brakes. If you're looking around under an early P6 to check things like the boot floor and the sills, just have a quick cursory glance at the rear diff. If it's got a little weep on it, that's probably okay, but if it's covered in oil and potentially dripping, we'd walk away, because that's going to be all kinds of problems and complications and expense that frankly you probably don't want. Finally, P6s have got a steering box, and it's remarkably precise for a car with a box. If it doesn't feel quite precise enough though, if the steering doesn't take the same amount of pressure to go left or right, then it's a good chance you can actually adjust that slack out of it. But do bear in mind that if you adjust it too far the other way, you could end up with really stiff, heavy steering, and that's not very pleasant either. You could be in for a new steering box, which isn't cheap or fun to do, but it will make a world of difference if your one is worn out. Finally, P6 power steering. It's pretty much a given that it's going to be a bit noisy. We've never come across a P6 that doesn't have noisy power steering. Just go from lock to lock in a tight area at low speeds. If you've got a bit of hissing and so on, unfortunately that's pretty much par for the course, but it is worth checking under the bonnet, check there is enough fluid in there and that it's not leaking out, because if that fails, yeah, it's a little bit harder to turn these cars around. They're not small, even by modern standards. The P6 interior is a lovely place to be. Like the exterior, it's modern and futuristic and yet contemporary. Most of the trim is available new if you need to replace it, but not Toledo Red. That is a particularly rare one that there isn't much existing of new or secondhand. The leather seats, like with any car, will require feeding and dyeing occasionally, but like this car, if it's too far gone really to save, you can buy whole new seat cover kits, or you can buy brand new or secondhand seats. Some later cars had nylon trim, which sadly is no longer available. You're either going to have to buy second-hand or have a full retrim to get it all to match, so that's worth considering. After 1964, the wood was replaced with artificial wood known as Formica, and that does have its benefits. For a start, there's no flaking or cracking lacquer to deal with, but it's not uncommon for these trims along the doors, which aren't actually held in with anything, to move when the door is shut. So just have a feel, make sure it doesn't wiggle around, and have a look at the condition of it. Is it scratched or cracking? While you're around the doors, the seals are held in by these lovely steel kick plates, but if they're loose or they're rusty or they're buckled, it won't be holding the seal down tightly enough, and that will ultimately cause water ingress, which will either rot out those vital sills or allow damp into your interior. So check that they're tight, check there's no rust around them, feel that they're flush, and look for any signs of water ingress in the car, like that smell of damp or indeed any water staining on the carpets. But other than that, if it's all good, just drink it all in. Unlike the Citroen DS, P6s remain remarkably affordable considering what they represent. You can get into a project example for around £1,000, but considering the relatively low values across the board, we would advise against those really cheap projects because they're probably not going to be economically viable to restore. For a good usable example of a 4-cylinder P6 though, you want to look to budget from £4,000 to £6,000, and that will get you a 2000 or a 2200. You'll have your choice of colours, your choice of spec, and whatever colour you buy it in, it's going to look great. It'll be usable, but it might not be quite up to show standard. If only that glorious 3500 V8 will do for you though, start your search around £7,000 to £8,000, and that'll buy you a reasonable condition driver, but the very best 4-cylinder cars will barely command over 10 grand, and the best V8s will be £15,000 to £20,000 depending on the condition, the spec. Because of their continued popularity, P6s are also pretty common on the classic car market, so don't be tempted to buy the first one you see for fear of not finding another. But whichever one you're looking at whatever budget, the P6 is a fantastic choice of a classic car. It's perhaps the only car that can rival the Citroen DS for a fraction of the price. It's comfortable, it corners remarkably well. This was the kind of car that Britain could truly be proud of. And if you have one, yeah, you'll be pretty proud of it too. This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.